A little while ago, we made a video called Top 12 Worst Exercises for Climbers, where we suggested the deadlift and bench press may not be great choices for some climbers. However, we got a lot of comments questioning that advice and believing that deadlifts and bench presses are amazing for climbers. So, who's right? To find out, we're going to get two outside perspectives. We'll have Tom Randall from the Wide Boys and Lattice give us a coach's perspective, and then we'll have my YouTube climber idol, Emil Abrahamsson, give us a super strong climber's perspective. Plus, we'll have Doctor of Physical Therapy and Tree Trunk for Legs, Michael Gaspari, to show us how to actually perform them. Much of this advice will be applicable to other common exercises and training scenarios, so let's get into it. Let's start by quickly learning some of the anatomy behind the deadlift and bench press so we know what we're working with. The deadlift, though it may look simple, involves activation of so many muscles. But traditionally, the big movers are the glutes, hamstrings, quads, and paraspinals or erector spinae muscles. Then, to help keep our shoulders in a safe and strong position, various other muscles turn on, including the lats, traps, and delts. Our core muscles will also be active if we perform the lift correctly. So the deadlift pretty much uses everything, right? In some sense, yes, but I want to be clear about something. Just because a muscle or group of muscles is being used during a movement does not mean it is being effectively trained by that movement, and more specifically, does not mean it is being effectively trained for climbing. Just keep that in mind for now, and we'll discuss it in more depth later in the video. As for bench press anatomy, aspects of the anterior core will be involved for stability, but the main focus is on the pec major and minor, the triceps, delts, favoring the anterior delt, and the subscapularis, a rotator cuff muscle. The serratus anterior is also involved, especially if you finish the rep with that scapular protraction, as well as the mid-back muscles for stabilization of the shoulder blades. Even the lats are involved to help move the bar when it's at its lowest point. But hopefully people aren't using the bench press to build massive lats. Rather, many climbers use it as a means to build chest strength for a couple different reasons. One, they heard they need to balance out their pull training with push training to help avoid certain injuries, #antagonists. Or two, they believe the strength gains from benching will help them climb harder, particularly with things like compression moves and mantles. But is that true? Let's see what Lattice has to say.
Hi, my name's Tom Randall. I am one of the coaches and founders at Lattice Training. I'm going to be talking to you about deadlifting and bench pressing and our perspective as coaches at Lattice and how we use this with our athletes, all the way from people like Will Bosey, top high-end elite athlete, through to weekend warriors who are training or climbing 2 times a week. So one of the questions we always get asked is, would you even use them if you're actually trying to get better at climbing? So I'm going to give you some of the pros and cons of both of these exercises so that you understand from our perspective how and when we use them. One, motivation. It kind of goes under the radar that people don't think of this as being an actual factor, but if you find it motivating to do these 2 exercises in your training and you enjoy this and you get something from it, I say go for it. Also, muscle building, so increasing muscle mass. Both these exercises really excellent for that. Anecdotally, we've also seen really good results for people trying to break through into their first one-armers from doing bench press as one exercise in relation to that. Interesting, I know, anecdotal, yes. And then lastly is developing a tolerance and a comfort and a confidence for lifting heavy weights. Many of you might only be lifting 20, 30 kilos, so 40, 50 pounds of weight, but have you ever lifted 200 pounds of weight or 250 pounds of weight? These are both great exercises at developing towards that. Okay, cons. There are some potential pitfalls for both of these exercises, and we recognize this as coaches with what we do. First up is it can be a waste of time and energy at the wrong time of the season. They're both exercises that are new skills to you potentially, so they're going to take time, energy, resource to learn, and they can also be quite expensive in terms of the equipment that you require for these, so they're not a cheap and easy setup. And lastly is that the muscle coactivation or coordination involved with these movements may not be relevant to the climbing that you're doing, so you do need to be a little careful with that. That the specificity is low. This is not directly related into climbing. What are the indicators for using these 2 exercises? When's appropriate? And this really comes down to having the right knowledge for training, the right time, and then also the resources for training. So do you know your methods? Do you know how to do these exercises? Do you have adequate time? Is that focus deployed in this exercise correctly now? And lastly, do you have the resources? Do you have the right equipment to do for these exercises? If you've got all three, there's a good chance that both of these exercises are really good for you and your climbing. But I do want you to remember that you want to create some kind of variability in those exercises. They're not the only things to do for those particular chains of activation or muscles that involve with those movements. It's really important that you vary these across the year and also think about the intention, so the outcome that you have in terms of your training and your goals.
Super thanks to Lattice for sharing their knowledge. And in case you're curious about that one-arm pull-up anecdote, you might be surprised to learn that the pectoral muscles are actually involved in this movement. The one-arm pull-up, especially from a neutral position, is primed for the pec major muscle to help as we move from a flexed and abducted position to a more extended and adducted one. So having good strength in the pec major is very helpful, and the bench press can help build that strength. Pretty neat. But now, let's see what Emil has to say on the matter.
All right, Hoopers Beta, y'all wanted a little bit of information about the DL and the BP. Well, here's the breakdown. So I'm on a van trip right now in Ticino, and obviously I brought weights. I do this always, every single day. A bit of DL in the morning, like just pumping it out, and then in the afternoon, maybe a bit of BP. That's just the way it works when you're like high level climbing and you're on a trip. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. But also, to extend on that, that's maybe not my full opinion. I also have some more thoughts on gym training for climbers, and I figured I would go through them in a more honest way, because I honestly don't do this every single day. I don't think that you need to do deadlifts and bench pressing like to add to your climbing. I personally think it's a good way to avoid injury, just kind of keeping my body more strong overall, which in turn makes me feel less fragile, and I think that's good. But I don't think it's necessary to climb hard. How I incorporate these is a bit tricky because it often goes in waves. I think when I feel like I don't want to climb, like I shouldn't be climbing as much as I am, I'll include gym training, but I don't do deadlifts or bench press on a very regular basis. I have done it in periodization forms, but it's really not something that I feel is super necessary if I'm having good climbing flow and I'm feeling strong and fit. But whenever I start to dip, I incorporate it a bit into my training, and then I get back into shape, and it makes me like I feel connected throughout my entire body. So if you think of your body as a big chain, it connects the different links. So it connects my core, like doing deadlifts for instance, connects my core down to my butt, and then all the way down to my feet. So I do think it's beneficial, but I don't think you should prioritize it over climbing at all, unless you kind of have to because of injury or otherwise. You might just need a little bit of a break from climbing from time to time. It's good to take a few weeks off here and there, every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks or so, and just dial it down a little bit, and then you could include some gym training to get more overall fitness instead. So that's kind of how I think is a good way to prioritize it. Don't gym train 6 times a week and then climb 6 times a week. Instead, do like a lot of climbing, and then when you've been climbing for a few too many weeks in a row, supplement or like add some gym training onto that. And so for the final question, should you prioritize gym training to climbing? Absolutely not. Climbing always comes first. Don't forget it. But it's fun to do deadlifts as well, so if you like them, do them.
All right, I'm convinced. I'm definitely integrating the DL and the BP into my daily routine. Guaranteed V15. But in all seriousness, having a stronger body overall can definitely be useful for avoiding injuries and feeling good, but neither exercise is absolutely essential to add to your training if you want to climb hard. If these exercises suit your intentions, resources, and abilities, then they can be great choices. But how do you know if deadlifts and bench press, DL and BP, are actually doing those things? This is where I think it's really easy for climbers to get tripped up. So let's try and shed some light on it. We'll talk about the deadlift first because it needs a bit more nuance. We need to remember that training specificity is important, and as Tom alluded to, the deadlift is not extremely specific for climbers. So you might think, okay, the specificity of the full movement is kinda low, but the muscles it uses are super relevant to climbing, so it must be good, right? Remember earlier in the video when we mentioned that just because an exercise activates or uses a particular muscle does not mean that that exercise is effectively training that muscle for your intended purposes. For example, gripping a barbell uses your finger flexor muscles, but it's not an effective way of training finger strength for small holds, especially compared to something like hangboarding or even climbing. deadlifts engage your lats, but they'd be a terrible choice for trying to get better at pull-up strength. And yes, the deadlift involves coordination and tension between a lot of relevant climbing muscles, but that doesn't mean all of those muscles are receiving an optimal amount or type of stimulus to be trained for climbing. Next time you see someone equating muscle engagement to muscle strengthening, tread cautiously. Finally, you might say, okay fine, but I know it's great training for my lower body, so that's a huge win. Well, of course, having good lower body strength is useful for climbing. However, again, there are many other ways to train lower body strength that can be more specific to certain aspects of climbing while also being less whole body fatiguing. Also, climbers simply don't need massive lower body strength, nor do they want to be weighed down by massive legs. So where does that leave us? Basically, the deadlift is an awesome compound exercise if it suits your goals, but make sure it actually suits your goals. As for the bench press, things are simpler. In my opinion, the bench press simply trains more relevant muscles for climbing than the deadlift. Though I will say I slightly prefer ring dips over bench press because they strengthen essentially the same muscles and are generally more accessible. I would also argue that ring dips are a bit more specific to climbing than the bench press, though I will admit that last point is fairly subjective and specificity is not the end-all be-all variable. But ultimately, like we said in the 12 worst exercises video, we absolutely do not have a vendetta against the bench press, and you hopefully know by now that whether or not an exercise is good or bad is highly dependent on you. If you decide you do want to give the deadlift or bench press a try, here's how to do it safely and effectively.
All right, hi everyone. So my name is Michael Gaspari. I'm a physical therapist, and today we're going to be working on deadlifting, particularly if you're a newcomer, someone who's climbing wants to try deadlifting more often, but you don't really know where to start. You're maybe worried about form and want to make sure you're doing things a little bit more efficiently and optimally. So as far as foot position, it has taken me a little bit of time to find what's best for me. So really I try to defer to comfort when I can. But typically I'll shoot for just about hips width apart, and I tend to prefer turning the toes out slightly. You'll see a wide variety of what people do, but I tend to prefer that just given that the glutes are going to add that rotary component through your legs. And I want to get close to the bar. If I'm looking directly down, it's right over my midfoot, so right in the middle of my feet. And I want things nice and even, so obviously being right in the middle of the bar, not being offset one side or the other. My hands are going to be about shoulder width apart too. As I come down, I just try to sit for a moment and just make sure I'm in a proper position. I'm starting with my shins against the bar. When I'm going for a rep, I want to usually take a breath first and extend, almost showing the world my chest, trying to look straight ahead and standing up. So as we go, again, I'm remembering to drag the bar up and down from my shins. When I get to about here, it really becomes a matter of just trying to push my hips forward, right around that knee, kind of midway through the rep. It sort of shifts from me extending to pushing forward, using my glutes to really push my hips into the bar. I think you brought up a good point about the shoulders. Maybe starting out, just making sure I'm not shrugging or leaning too far forward, but really putting them backwards. And again, I think a good cue is really show your chest, really try to push your chest forward. If there was a mirror in front of you, you want to make sure you're pointing your chest at that mirror, and so you can see yourself. For someone more specifically working on deadlifting and wanting to get stronger with deadlifting, working up to working sets of 3 or lower, 3 to 1, higher RPE in the 8-9 range can be beneficial. But for someone whose goal really isn't about deadlifting and you're really just using it to get stronger in general, working up to sets of around 5 I think can be really beneficial, but making sure you keep some reps in the tank. So your RPE is still probably around 7. You got some reps left in the tank, but you're still straining pretty hard, straining pretty heavy, and probably shooting for about, maybe starting out 3 working sets, but you can bump that up as you get more trained to about 5 or even 6 working sets of a good 3 to 5. All right, so for bench press, great for just this compound movement for the upper body. Really obviously working the chest, the triceps, front of the shoulders as well, the deltoids. So for this, range is going to be a little different, and the form obviously very, very different. So at first when we set up, I like to try to make sure you're comfortable on the bench and that the bar is just about mid of sight. Like if I was looking straight ahead, the bar cuts my vision in half. Naturally, you are going to be slightly flexed above 90 degrees, but as you lift off, you're going to bring it to about vertical over your shoulders. So if I'm really starting with it here, or if I'm starting with it kind of almost back, I'm going to be spending energy that I want to put into the bar, and it'll be a little wasted. So as we pull down, we are going to notice it is going to come forward a little bit to the chest, and that's okay. And as we press, we're pressing up vertically and back over towards our vision. So it's rare that the bench is pure side to side, my elbows come flared out. This is just not a comfortable position. So we want it to come a little bit more forward and press up a little diagonally from your chest to directly vertical over your shoulders. For the wrists, I often want to look at making sure you're packed nice and tight, not having the wrists extended like this. Some people even tend to have this type of grip. Again, I think that's not wrong. It's definitely not my favorite method. It feels a little uncomfortable in the wrist, honestly, and you risk the bar rolling if you don't have your thumb around it when you go a lot heavier. So just making sure as you come down, you get that nice smooth effort, and those elbows are not flared to the side or super close. My elbows are almost directly underneath my wrists, and I'm pressing straight up towards the ceiling. For the shoulders, often I think a great setup would be, as you get on the bench, pinching them back. For me, that's what feels most comfortable. It just feels like everything's nice and tight and secure. So rather than laying on the bench and just having the shoulders here, right where they are, I want to almost tuck those shoulder blades back, and I almost use the edge of the bench here to get into a better position. So naturally, you'll notice my chest is going to rise a little bit when I do that. So it's almost, again, similar to deadlift, when you kind of puff your chest out. Some people rail against arching, call it cheating. I like it. It feels comfortable for me. For someone new, I wouldn't worry too much about it other than the shoulders. Really making sure you can pack those shoulder blades behind you and still reach overhead comfortably. Find that comfortable wrist position. Make it look as if you're about to throw a punch into the bar and not dipping. Typically what I'll do is shoot for, depending, probably about 5 reps, similar to deadlift, 5 reps for that RPE 7, and doing a good 4 to 5 working sets of that. I usually do that for about 6 weeks, so I'll do kind of that style over the course of 6 weeks, and ideally keeping track of that weight. It'll get a little bit better over that course, because if you're still working at that RPE 7, naturally over time, a heavier weight is going to be that same intensity. Once you feel really confident, I'd say you can really push up to that RPE 8, even 9 at 2 to 3 reps or even 1 if you want. But
will you be incorporating either of these exercises into your training now? Do you think one is more useful than the other? If you want more training and climbing psych, be sure to visit Lattice's and Emil's channels. Until next time, train, climb, send, repeat.